The Galactic Council fell silent. That's a human army. The ship smelled like recycled air and cold metal, and I had already been awake for 31 hours when Ambassador Claire Donnelly walked up beside me and said, quietly, "Don't let them see you nervous." I was gripping the railing of the observation deck hard enough that my knuckles had gone white. Outside the reinforced glass, the Galactic Council station hung in space like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. It was enormous. I mean genuinely, incomprehensibly enormous. The station had been built by the Velthuri over 400 years ago, expanded 17 times since, and it now stretched across nearly 8 kilometers of open space, glittering with lights from 100 different docking ports. Ships of every conceivable shape were arriving and departing, long silver needles, wide flat discs, strange angular things that seemed to move sideways rather than forward. None of them looked anything like our vessel. Our vessel looked like a gray brick. I exhaled and loosened my grip on the railing. "I'm not nervous," I said. Donnelly glanced at me sideways. She was a small woman in her late 50s, with short silver hair and calm gray eyes that had seen a great many difficult rooms. She had been Earth's lead negotiator for 11 years before the council seat was offered. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Your left boot is untied," she said, and walked away toward the briefing room. I looked down. It was. I tied it, straightened up, and told myself to get it together. "My name is Leon Ward. I am, or was at that point, a staff sergeant in the Earth Diplomatic Escort Corps, a unit that most people in the regular forces had never heard of, because we didn't do the kind of work that ended up in news reports. We escorted diplomats. We secured rooms. We stood near important people and tried to look like we were not counting exits. That was the job. I had been doing it for 6 years, and I was good at it, and I had never once imagined I would end up on the station at the center of galactic politics, standing next to the first human ambassador ever given a formal seat at the council table. I was there because I was available. That was the honest answer. The original escort team had been reassigned after the incident on Kepler Outpost 3, nothing dramatic, a scheduling conflict, I was told, though nobody ever explained it fully, and I had been the closest qualified replacement. My commanding officer, Colonel Derek Parrish, had called me at 4 in the morning and said, "Ward, pack a bag. You're going to the council station." I had asked how long for. He had said, "However long it takes." I had packed a bag. Now, standing on the observation deck watching the Velthuri station grow larger in the window, I tried to remember everything I had been briefed on during the transit. The Galactic Council had been in operation for nearly 6 centuries. It had 41 member species. Decisions were made by a weighted vote, with older species carrying more influence. Earth had been granted a provisional seat, not a full seat, not a voting seat, not yet, after a petition process that had taken 12 years to complete. We were the newest members by a margin of about 80 years. The second newest species, a quiet, slow-moving people called the Sorrenti, had been around long enough to vote. We were still, technically, guests. And right now, the guests had a problem. The Croth Dominion, a large, aggressive, expansionist civilization from the far edge of the mapped galaxy, had filed a formal notice with the Council 14 days ago. The notice stated that 3 human colony worlds, Garvey's Reach, New Aberdeen, and the Mira Cluster, fell within what the Croth called their natural sphere of integration. That phrase was diplomatic language. What it meant, in practical terms, was that the Croth had decided they wanted those worlds and intended to take them. They had done it before, to 2 other species, both of whom had been smaller and less organized than us and had ended up, after various council mediation processes, losing the territories anyway. The council had issued statements. The Croth had nodded politely and taken the worlds regardless. Nobody had stopped them. And now it was our turn. The briefing materials I had read on the transit made it very clear what Earth was expected to do in this situation. We were expected to come to the council, present our case, request protection or mediation, and then accept whatever compromise was offered, probably something like giving up Garvey's Reach in exchange for a guarantee that New Aberdeen and the Mira Cluster would remain ours for the next 100 years, or something along those lines. That was the pattern. That was how it worked. Young species came to the council suit things, the young species walked away with less than they had arrived with, and everybody called it diplomacy. I had read all of that. I understood it. And none of it explained why Colonel Parrish had looked, during our 4 in the morning call, like a man who was trying very hard not to smile. We docked at 0940 station time. The docking corridor alone was long enough to drive a vehicle through, which made me feel small in a way I was not accustomed to feeling. 2 Velthuri station attendants met us at the airlock, tall, pale blue, vaguely human in shape but with 4 arms and eyes that were solid silver, and led us through a series of corridors toward the diplomatic reception area. Every species we passed looked at us. Some of them were subtle about it. Some were not. A group of what I later learned were Marathi counselors stopped their conversation entirely and watched us walk by, their wide dark eyes tracking Donnelly and me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between curiosity and mild amusement. That was the thing I noticed most in those first few hours. The amusement. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of expression you might have if you watched a child trying to carry something slightly too heavy for them, a sort of gentle, patient readiness to catch them when they stumbled. Nobody expected us to stumble badly. They expected us to stumble the usual amount. A Velthuri diplomat named Orithvel, senior protocol officer, according to the credentials card clipped to his coat, showed us to the preparation suite assigned to the human delegation. It was a perfectly adequate room. Clean, functional, equipped with atmospheric scrubbers that kept the air at human comfortable levels. There was a long table, several chairs, and a wide window that looked out over one of the station's interior plazas, a vast open space where dozens of species moved and gathered, full of color and noise and the strange beauty of a place where many different kinds of people had learned to share space. Orithvel spoke excellent standard Galactic, which the translation device in my ear rendered into clear English. He explained the schedule. The council session would begin in 6 hours. The human delegation would be introduced formally, given an opportunity to make an opening statement, and then the Croth territorial claim would be brought to the floor for discussion. He said all of this pleasantly and efficiently. He did not say anything unkind. But as he was leaving, he paused at the door and said, with what I believe was genuine goodwill, "Ambassador Donnelly, if your delegation requires any guidance on council procedure before the session, requesting mediation, filing a compromise framework, that sort of thing, my office is available. We have helped many new member species navigate these situations." Donnelly thanked him warmly. He left. She waited until the door closed, then sat down at the table and opened the case she had been carrying since we boarded the ship. It contained, as far as I could see, a single sealed data chip and a small silver communicator. She set both on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Sergeant Ward," she said. "Yes, Ambassador. In 6 hours, we are going to walk into the largest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy." She kept her eyes on the data chip. "And we are going to say something that no species in the station's history has ever said in quite this way." She picked up the chip and turned it over in her fingers. "I need you to be ready for the room to go very quiet." I looked at her. "How quiet?" She set the chip down and looked up at me, and for just a moment, behind the calm gray eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not nervousness. Something older than nervousness. Something that looked, if I am being honest, like a person who has been carrying a very large secret for a very long time and is almost relieved to finally put it down. "Very quiet," she said. "The kind of quiet this station has probably never heard before." I didn't ask her anything else. I sat down across from her, folded my hands on the table, and spent the next 6 hours thinking about what that could possibly mean. I did not come up with the right answer. Nobody could have come up with the right answer. Some things you simply have to walk into and see for yourself. The chamber was bigger than I expected, and I had expected it to be very big. It was a circular room, maybe 200 meters across, built in rising tiers so that every seat had a clear line of sight to the central floor below. The ceiling was open to a dome of reinforced transparent material, through which the stars were visible, cold and steady and indifferent. Around the chamber, each member species had a section, marked by the colors and materials their cultures favored, so the effect was something like looking at a living mosaic. The Velthuri section was cool blue and silver. The Croth section, and I noted exactly where it was from the moment we entered, was dark, angular, almost aggressively geometric, all hard lines and deep red lighting. Our section was a modest alcove near the lower tier. 6 seats, a small desk, a translation console. Nothing decorative. We had not had time to decorate. We sat down, Donnelly at the center, me 2 seats to her right in my capacity as escort and security, and the 2 junior aides beside her. The remaining seats were empty. Earth had not sent a large delegation. There had been a reason for that, which I did not yet understand. The session opened with ceremony that lasted nearly 40 minutes, formal introductions of each delegation, readings from the council charter, acknowledgement of the current agenda. I sat straight and watched the room and did what I was trained to do: catalog, observe, assess. I counted 14 species I could identify and at least 9 I couldn't. I noted the positions of the station security officers, who stood at even intervals around the outer ring. I noted the exits. I noted that the Croth ambassador, a large, broad-shouldered being with a flat, gray face and eyes set wide apart, spent almost the entire opening ceremony looking at our alcove. Not with hostility. With something more unsettling than hostility. With patience. When the formal opening concluded, the council chair, a Velthuri elder named Councillor San, who had apparently held the position for 63 years, welcomed Earth officially. He used careful, measured words. He expressed the council's pleasure at humanity's growing participation in galactic affairs. He said nothing about the Croth claim. Not yet. Donnelly rose and gave Earth's opening statement. It was brief. She thanked the council. She expressed Earth's respect for the traditions and values the council represented. She said humanity was honored to stand in this chamber for the first time. She sat down. It was polite. It was exactly what everyone in the room expected. I heard the faint, untranslated murmur of conversation ripple through the upper tiers, the relaxed sound of people who believed they knew exactly how the next several hours would proceed. Then Councillor San moved to the Croth claim. The Croth ambassador, whose name I had memorized from the briefing documents, Vakrathen, senior territorial emissary of the Dominion, rose slowly and with complete composure. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes. The translation in my ear was smooth and precise. He explained that the 3 human worlds in question, Garvey's Reach, New Aberdeen, and the Mira Cluster, had been identified as falling within the Croth Dominion's historical expansion corridor. He presented charts. He cited prior council precedents. He used language that was almost academic in its calmness. He did not raise his voice once. What he was saying, underneath all of the careful language, was simple: these worlds are ours now. We are informing you. This is not a question. He sat down. The chamber murmured again. Councillor San asked if the human delegation wished to respond. Donnelly stood up. She did not look at her notes. She did not look at Vakrathen. She looked at the center of the chamber, at the council itself, and she spoke in a voice that was completely, almost unnervingly calm. The human delegation thanks the council for the opportunity to respond, she said. We have prepared a formal statement regarding Earth's position on the Croth Territorial Declaration. With the council's permission, we would like to submit that statement to the chamber record at this time. Councillor San inclined his head. Permission granted. Donnelly reached into the case on the desk in front of her. She took out the small data chip I had seen her holding in the preparation suite 6 hours earlier. She placed it into the submission port on the side of the translation console. The chamber's main display system activated. It was designed to show submitted documents to all delegations simultaneously, a practical necessity when 41 species with 41 different written languages were trying to read the same thing. Whatever was on Donnelly's chip began rendering across every screen in the chamber at once. And then the room changed. It didn't change loudly. It changed the way a held breath changes a room, silently, completely, instantly. One moment there was the low ambient sound of a functioning diplomatic chamber, the soft hum of translation systems, the faint rustle of movement, the occasional quiet exchange between delegates. And then all of that stopped. I watched it happen in sections, like a wave moving outward from the screens. The Velthuri delegates on my left looked at their display, and went still. The Sorrenti delegation, 3 rows up, went still. The Marathai, who had stared at us in the corridor that morning with such calm amusement, went still. I saw one of them slowly set down the object they had been holding and not pick it up again. I could not see our display from where I was sitting. My screen was angled away from my position. I had not been given advance information on what the chip contained. Parrish had told me, when I asked before departure, you'll see it when they see it. That's the point. At the time I had found that irritating. Now, watching the chamber go quiet, I began to understand. Vakrathen, the Croth ambassador, was sitting very still. He was looking at his screen. His wide-set eyes had not moved in nearly 20 seconds. That might not sound significant, but I had read enough about Croth physiology during the briefing to know that they were not a species given to stillness. They were constant, deliberate movers, shifting weight, adjusting posture, turning their heads in small increments. It was apparently just how their nervous system worked. But right now, Vakrathen was sitting like a stone. I leaned very slightly toward the junior aide on my left, a young man named Philip Granger who had been with Donnelly's team for 3 years. I pitched my voice low enough that only he could hear. Granger. What's on the screen? Granger turned to look at me. His face was an expression I had not seen on him before and would not easily forget. It was not pride, exactly. It was not shock. It was something in between the two, the face of a person looking at something they had known was true but had never quite seen written out in numbers before. Fleet deployments, he said quietly. Ours. How many? He paused. He looked back at the screen, then back at me. All of them, he said. I did not ask another question. I faced forward, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Counselor San sat at the head of the chamber for a long time without speaking. He was looking at his screen with an expression of careful, deliberate composure, the expression of a man whose job required him to appear unshaken by things that were, in fact, shaking him. Finally, he spoke. The chair recognizes the human delegation. Ambassador Donnelly, would you like to address the chamber regarding the contents of this submission? Donnelly stood. She had not sat back down since rising for the statement. She clasped her hands behind her back, a posture I associated, from 6 years of escorting her colleagues, with a diplomat who is about to say something that is going to be in history books. Thank you, Counselor, she said. What the Council is now viewing is Earth's formal military response declaration. The figures presented represent current, verified, active deployment status as of 14 days ago, the date of the Croth territorial filing. She let that land for a moment. It landed. Earth is not here to request mediation. We are not here to negotiate the terms of a compromise. We are here to inform the Council that the 3 worlds named in the Croft Declaration are human worlds, they will remain human worlds, and the force currently positioned to ensure that outcome has been in place for some time. She paused again. We felt the Council deserved to know. The room did not respond with noise. It responded with more silence, a deeper kind than before, if that is possible, like the silence had weight now, like it was pressing on the walls of the chamber. Vakrathen had not moved. I kept watching him. I had been trained to watch the most dangerous person in the room at all times, and whatever he was now, whatever the Croft Dominion was after looking at those numbers, the most important change was happening somewhere inside that stillness. I heard something clatter in the Marathai section. Someone had dropped something. Nobody picked it up. Counselor San cleared his throat. It was the loudest sound in the chamber. The Council will require a moment to review the documentation in full, he said. His voice was admirably steady. The session will recess for 30 minutes. Donnelly sat down. She did not look at me. She looked straight ahead at the center of the chamber, at the spot where all those species with all those centuries of history between them were sitting with her numbers on their screens, and she looked like a person who had just set down something very heavy and was taking her first full breath in a long time. I looked at the data chip sitting in the submission port. Small thing. About the size of my thumbnail. And somewhere on it were numbers that had just made 40 civilizations forget how to speak. Nobody around us said a word during the recess. Not to us, anyway. I could see delegates from at least 6 different species talking quietly and urgently among themselves, heads bent, eyes moving back and forth between their screens and our alcove. They were reassessing. I recognized the process because I had done it myself many times, walking back through everything you thought you knew about a situation and trying to work out at which point your understanding had gone wrong. I thought about Colonel Parrish. I thought about his expression at 4 in the morning. I thought about the word available, the reason I had been told I was assigned to this mission, and I wondered, sitting there in the quiet of the chamber recess, whether anything about this moment had actually been left to chance at all. 30 minutes later, the session resumed. And what happened next was the part nobody in that room would forget for a very long time. Orithken had not been born into intelligence work. He had, as a young Velthuri, wanted to study botanical science, the slow, patient work of cataloging plant life on newly mapped worlds, the kind of occupation that asked very little of you in terms of urgency and a great deal in terms of patience and careful observation. His aptitude assessments had redirected him. Apparently, the skills required for careful botanical observation, cataloging small details, detecting patterns across long time scales, updating conclusions when new evidence appeared, were also the skills required for intelligence analysis. He had been told this at the age of 22 and had spent the following 61 years doing exactly what he had always done, just with species rather than plants. He was, at this particular moment, sitting in the senior observer gallery that ran along the uppermost ring of the council chamber, the section reserved for staff and analysts who needed to observe sessions without being delegates, and he was doing something he could not remember doing since his third year as an analyst. He was reconsidering everything from the beginning. The gallery had gone as quiet as the chamber floor. Around him, 24 colleagues from various species intelligence services, the Valthuri Bureau, the Marathi Coordination Office, the Sorrenti Long Range Assessment Division, were staring at their own portable screens with the particular expression of professionals who have just discovered a significant error in their own prior work. Nobody was speaking. The room had the feel of a group of very competent people each privately working through the same problem. At what point did we get this wrong, and how far back does the error go? Orithken was further along in this process than most of them, because Orithken had been the primary analyst responsible for the Valthuri Bureau's assessment of Earth for the past 19 years. The report he had authored, Terrestrial Species 7741H, Developmental Assessment and Geopolitical Projection, revised 6 times over those 19 years, was currently, he suspected, going to require a 7th revision that was substantially longer and in several key respects diametrically opposite to the previous 6. He pulled the latest version of his own report on his screen and began reading it with the cold, detached focus of a man reviewing his own work for the first time as an outsider. The report was, he had to admit, well written. It was thorough. It was internally consistent. And it was, he now suspected, built on a foundational error so basic that it made every subsequent conclusion unreliable. The error was this: he had assessed human military capacity using the same frameworks he had used for every other emerging species. Those frameworks were built on 6 centuries of data from 41 member species. They were excellent frameworks. They had produced accurate assessments of developmental trajectories for the Sorrenti, the Marathi, the Pelavar, and 11 other species that Orithken had personally analyzed over his career. The framework asked, how much of this species' productive output is directed toward defense infrastructure? What is their current standing force size? What is the ratio of military to civilian spending? All of those numbers, for humanity, had looked modest. Manageable. Appropriate for a species at their level of galactic integration. That was what the framework said. And Orithken had written it down, revised it 6 times, and never questioned the framework itself. What he had not accounted for, what no version of the framework had ever needed to account for, because no other species had made it necessary, was the possibility that the numbers were not all the numbers. He opened a secondary file on his screen. It was a historical data compilation he had built over the years, a background reference document containing records of human activity that had not seemed directly relevant to the military assessment. Economic records. Trade filings. Infrastructure development reports. Colonial expansion registries. Transport fleet manifests. He had used it occasionally, for context, but it had not been part of the core analysis. He began going through it now with different eyes. The shipyards on Earth's moon, listed in trade filings as commercial transport construction facilities. They had been operating continuously for 42 years. At full capacity, they could produce 1 large vessel every 11 days. Orithken did not have figures for how many vessels they had actually produced, because the data was contained in internal human government records that the Valthuri Bureau had not had access to. He had assumed the production rate was lower than maximum capacity, because that was normal. Species did not usually run military production at full capacity during peacetime. They maintained reserve capacity and kept costs down. He was beginning to suspect that assumption was wrong. The colonial administration reports from the outer human settlements, the worlds that were now, based on the data chip currently rendering on every screen in the chamber below, apparently the most heavily fortified collection of inhabited planets outside the Croth Dominion's own core systems. Those reports had listed, consistently, over 4 decades, population figures, agricultural output, resource extraction rates. They had also listed, in a footnote category that translated into Valthuri roughly as civic infrastructure development, a steady and growing series of construction projects. Orithken had noted these. He had not flagged them because the category description was civilian, and the scale, while large, had seemed consistent with the development needs of growing colonial populations. Docking infrastructure. Power generation facilities. Communication relay networks. Atmospheric processing stations. He stared at the list for a long time. Those were not just colonial infrastructure projects. The scale was wrong. The density was wrong. A civilian colony of 200,000 people did not need 18 heavy-grade docking facilities. It didn't need distributed underground power systems designed to continue operating if surface installations were damaged. It didn't need the kind of redundant communication architecture that would allow the settlement to maintain command and control function during an external disruption. It needed those things if it was also a military staging point. Orithkin closed that file and opened another one, a compilation of human cultural data. Historical documents, primarily. He had assembled this one not for security purposes but out of genuine interest. He had always found human history fascinating, not always pleasant, but fascinating in the way that certain rare botanical species were fascinating, because they had developed in conditions different enough from the norm that their evolutionary path had produced something genuinely unusual. He found the section he was looking for, a compiled timeline of human armed conflicts over the past 3,000 years. He had read this before. Many times. He had always processed it the way most galactic analysts processed it, as evidence of an unusually combative species that had, fortunately, grown out of its most dangerous tendencies by the time it reached the stars. The conflicts were historical. They were not current. Earth had been at peace, internally, for over 100 years. This was taken as evidence of maturation, of the species having moved through its aggressive phase. Reading it now, he was no longer sure that interpretation was correct. What he saw, looking at it again with the numbers from Donnelly's data chip still fresh in his mind, was not a species that had been violent and then stopped. What he saw was a species that had been at war, continuously, in one form or another, somewhere on its planet, for the majority of its recorded history, and had used that time to develop the most refined, sophisticated, and deeply institutionalized approach to organized conflict that any species he had ever analyzed had produced. They had industrialized it. That was the word that arrived in his mind and would not leave. They had taken the concept of armed force, which every species had, in some form, because every species had at some point needed to defend itself, and applied to it the same relentless, iterative improvement that they had applied to medicine, agriculture, and communication technology. They had built schools for it. They had built entire branches of mathematics around it. They had written philosophy about it, and then rewritten the philosophy when the philosophy turned out to be strategically suboptimal. And then, apparently, they had reached the stars and found that nobody was currently threatening them, and they had kept doing it anyway. Quietly. Methodically. Without announcement. He thought about a human phrase he had encountered in the cultural files, one that had stuck with him because it seemed to encapsulate something he hadn't fully understood at the time: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. He had catalogued it as an expression of anxiety. A reflection of a species that had been traumatized by its own history and could not quite believe the threat was gone. A kind of cultural nervousness. He understood now that he had been wrong. It was not anxiety. It was not nervousness. It was policy. It was, perhaps, the most fundamental policy a species could have, the quiet, patient, unending decision to never be caught unprepared, no matter how peaceful things appeared, no matter how long the peace had lasted. He looked back down at the chamber floor through the gallery window. Ambassador Donnelly was sitting calmly in the human alcove. The sergeant beside her, the one who had looked faintly overwhelmed during the corridor walk that morning, was sitting straight, hands folded, watching the room with a professional stillness that Orithkin now found considerably more interesting than he had before. He did not look overwhelmed now. He looked like a person who was doing exactly what he was trained to do, in exactly the conditions he had trained for. Orithkin pulled up a fresh analysis document and began typing. He typed quickly, the way he only typed when he had a great deal to say and needed to organize it before it became too large to hold. He wrote, "Foundational reassessment required. The framework applied to species 7741H has produced a systematically inaccurate picture of actual military capacity. The error is not in the data collection. The error is in the interpretive lens. We assumed that military capacity, for a peaceable species in a period of external non-conflict, would be maintained at functional minimum. This is the normal pattern. This is not the pattern humans followed. Humans maintained and expanded military capacity during peacetime not as a response to external threat, but as a matter of deeply embedded cultural and institutional priority. The distinction is critical, because it means that our standard indicators, current conflict status, recent threat environment, stated defense budgets, were all reading accurately and all telling us the wrong thing." He paused. Added, "It is worth noting that nothing humanity has done is in violation of any council charter provision. They filed accurate trade documents. They reported actual construction projects. They disclosed actual colony populations. Every individual data point, had we requested it, would have been provided truthfully. We did not request the right data points, because we were not asking the right questions, because we did not think there was a question worth asking. He looked up from the document. Below, in the chamber, Counselor San was preparing to reopen the session after the recess. Delegates were returning to their seats. The room was quieter than any council session Orithkan had ever observed, not the silence of boredom or of routine, but the silence of 40 civilizations trying to process a recalibration that none of them had seen coming. He looked at the human alcove. Donnelly was speaking quietly with her aide. The sergeant, Ward, his badge red, Orithkan could see it from here, was scanning the room methodically, calmly, with the unhurried attention of someone who had a great deal of training and was currently applying it. He met Orithkan's eyes for a moment, through the gallery window, without any particular reaction, and then continued his scan. Orithkan finished his note. He wrote one more line at the bottom, which was less analytical and more personal than anything he usually committed to official documents, but which he could not quite stop himself from writing. He wrote, "They have been the most prepared people in this chamber since the moment they arrived. We simply did not know how to look at what was right in front of us." He saved the document, closed his screen, and sat back to watch the session resume. The recess ended at exactly the moment it was scheduled to end. That, somehow, was the first thing that made the whole situation feel different. In a normal council session, recesses ran long. Delegates needed time. Conversations happened in corridors. Procedures slowed. It was the natural pace of 41 species trying to move together in any direction. But when Counselor San called the session back to order, every delegation was already seated, every screen was active, and the room was silent before he even finished his opening word. Everyone had done their thinking during the recess. Now they wanted to see what came next. I had done my own thinking. 6 years of escort work had given me a fairly reliable read on rooms, and what I was reading in this room was something I had no professional template for. In difficult diplomatic sessions, and I had sat through a few, the energy was usually tense, kinetic, full of small movements that communicated anxiety, strategy, or the desire to speak. This room was not tense in that way. It was still. It was the stillness of people who had just received information that had moved the ground under their feet, and who were being very careful about where they stepped next. Vakrathan, the Kroth ambassador, had returned to his seat. During the recess, I had watched him hold 2 separate, very brief conversations with other Kroth delegates in their section. I had watched the body language. The conversations were short because they did not need to be long. Whatever was being said was not complicated. Complicated conversations take time. Simple realizations, even large ones, can be communicated in a few words. Counselor San called the session to order and turned, with impeccable formality, to the Kroth delegation. The chair invites Ambassador Vakrathan to respond to the human submission. Vakrathan stood. He was, as I said, a large individual, broad across the shoulders, with a flat, gray, angular face that did not show expression in ways a human face would. But there was something different about his posture when he rose to speak this time. It was a very small difference. He was carrying himself more carefully. The way a person carries themselves when the ground has recently turned out to be less solid than expected and they are paying more attention to their footing. He spoke for 4 minutes. His translator rendered it cleanly into my earpiece. He said that the Kroth Dominion had noted the human documentation with interest. He said that the Dominion had always valued clear communication between advanced species, and that Earth's decision to present its position in such direct terms reflected a commendably forthright approach to galactic discourse. He said that the territorial filing, as submitted 14 days prior, had been prepared on the basis of the information available to the Dominion at that time, and that new information naturally required new consideration. He said that the Kroth would be requesting additional time to conduct a thorough review of all relevant documentation before any further formal positions were stated. He sat down. That was it. For minutes of very carefully arranged words whose only real content was, "We are not continuing this right now." I heard what might have been, from somewhere in the upper tiers of the chamber, the very faint sound of a long exhale. From which delegation, I couldn't tell. Possibly several. Donnelly did not react visibly. She nodded, once, slowly, the way she nodded when something was proceeding more or less as she had expected it to. I filed that away. Counselor San thanked the Kroth delegation and turned to Donnelly. Ambassador Donnelly, the Council notes the Kroth delegation's request for additional review time. Does the human delegation have any response at this stage? Donnelly stood. Earth has no objection to the Croft delegation taking time for review, she said. We would simply note, for the Council record, that Earth's position as stated in our submission is not contingent on the outcome of that review. The deployment status described in the document is current, it is accurate, and it will remain in place. She paused, just briefly. We appreciate the Council's attention. She sat down. It was the most efficiently devastating thing I had heard said in a diplomatic chamber. Not because it was unkind, it wasn't. Not because it was aggressive, it didn't need to be. It was devastating simply because of what it confirmed. We were not bluffing. The review wouldn't change anything. The numbers were real. The ships were there. The decision had been made long before we ever walked into this chamber, and it had not been made here, not in response to the Croft filing. It had been made years ago, quietly, in offices and shipyards and training facilities that no Galactic intelligence service had thought to ask too many questions about. The session continued for another hour. There were procedural matters, other agenda items, routine council business. None of it, I suspected, registered very strongly with most of the people in the room, because most of the people in the room were still processing what had happened in the first 40 minutes. I watched delegations throughout, the quiet conversations, the shifted glances toward our alcove, the very occasional look in my direction that I met with a steady, neutral expression and held until they looked away. 6 years of escort work. I had the neutral expression down. At one point, my communicator vibrated against my wrist. A single pulse. A message from Colonel Parrish, forwarded through our ship's communication system. It was 4 words. They said, confirmed. All positions nominal. I read it twice. Put the communicator away. Look straight ahead. All positions nominal. Not, our ships are ready to move, not, we're prepared to respond, nominal. Present tense. Functioning as normal. Which meant that whatever those numbers on the screen described, all of those ships, all of those personnel, the entire apparatus of Earth's response, they were not on their way. They were not being assembled. They were already there, already in position, already doing what they were doing, exactly as stated. They had been there for some time. They were simply in position, waiting, the way a person waits who has been waiting patiently for a very long time and is in no particular hurry. I had a strange feeling then. It was not pride, exactly. It was something quieter than pride, and in some ways more powerful. I thought about all the people who had made those numbers possible. The engineers who had spent their careers in shipyards, building what they were told to build and not asking too loudly why the quotas kept going up. The soldiers who had trained, year after year, for a scenario nobody had officially described to them, because they were soldiers and training was what soldiers did. The logistics teams who had moved supplies and fuel and equipment across vast distances and logged it in filing systems that Galactic analysts had apparently found too dull to investigate closely. The people who had sat at desks and made decisions and written reports and sent memos, all of it adding up over decades to something that now sat on a data chip the size of my thumbnail and had made 40 civilizations forget how to make noise. None of them were in this room. None of them would ever be in this room. This was the part they would not see. I was seeing it for all of them. The session ended. Councillor San closed the formal proceedings and announced that the Croft Territorial Review would be scheduled for a follow-up session at a date to be confirmed. The delegations began to move, filing out through the various exits, and the ambient sound of the chamber slowly rebuilt itself, footsteps, quiet conversation, the hum of translation systems being powered down. Donnelly was reviewing something on her own screen. I stood, surveyed the room one final time, and began the mental process of transitioning from in-session posture to corridor posture, which required slightly different awareness. I nearly didn't notice Orithkan until he was right beside me. He had come down from the observer gallery. He was about my height, pale blue, with the silver eyes that I had initially found disconcerting but had grown somewhat accustomed to. He was holding a small data pad against his side and looking at me with an expression I had trouble categorizing. It was not the polite amusement from that morning. It was something more considered. "Sergeant Ward," he said. His standard Galactic was impeccable, my earpiece barely needed to work. "Counselor," I said. I wasn't sure of his exact title, but counselor was always a safe default at this station. "Analyst," he corrected, without any particular sharpness. "Orithkan. Velthuri Bureau of Long-Range Assessment," he paused. "I have been the primary analyst for your species for 19 years. I looked at him. I said nothing. I wanted to say, he continued, that I believe my assessment was wrong. Substantially wrong, he said it simply, without drama. Not the way someone says something to make themselves seem humble, the way someone says something because it is true and they are the kind of person who says true things. I did not account for the right variables. I wouldn't know about that, I said. That's not my area. No, he agreed. You have a different area, he glanced toward Donnelly, who was closing her case. I have one question, if you are willing. I waited. Were you afraid? He asked. Coming into the chamber today. Knowing what was about to happen. I thought about the railing on the observation deck. My white knuckles. 31 hours without sleep. The boot that had been untied. I thought about 6 years of standing in rooms next to important people and counting exits, and I thought about all the rooms I had stood in where the stakes were considerably lower than today. Yes, I said. Every day of my career. He looked at me steadily. And yet you prepared anyway. That's the job, I said. He seemed to consider that for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and said, yes. I think I am beginning to understand that. He tucked his data pad more firmly under his arm. Good evening, Sergeant Ward. Good evening, Analyst Orithcan. He walked away toward the Velthuri exit. I watched him go, and then turned back to Donnelly, who had finished gathering her things and was waiting. Ready, she said. Yes, Ambassador. We walked out through the human alcove exit, down the long corridor, and back toward the docking section. Nobody stopped us. A few people watched us pass. The looks were different now than they had been that morning, not amused, not indifferent. More careful. The look you give something when you have revised your understanding of what it is. I filed my report that night in our ship's communications bay. It was a standard post-session debrief form. I filled in the required fields: location, duration, personnel present, significant events. Under the heading Outcome, the form gave me 6 lines. I used one of them. I wrote. The council fell silent. We stood there. That was enough. The follow-up session was scheduled for 11 days later. In the meantime, something unusual happened, several things, actually. The morning after the first session, Earth's communication team aboard our ship received a formal request for a private meeting from the Pelivar delegation. The Pelivar were a mid-tier council species, about 2 centuries ahead of us in terms of galactic integration, known mostly for their expertise in materials engineering and their careful neutrality in most political matters. They had not been involved in the Kroth issue in any way. They were not an obvious ally or adversary of anyone. They were simply one of the 41. Donnelly accepted the meeting. I attended as escort. The Pelivar ambassador, a woman named Counselor Verith, had brought 2 aides and a small translation device of her own as a backup. She was compact, with 4-fingered hands and amber-colored skin and a very direct way of speaking that I found immediately comfortable. She sat down across from Donnelly, folded her hands on the table, and said, without preamble, Ambassador Donnelly, the Pelivar delegation would like to understand Earth's long-term intentions in the outer sectors. Donnelly said, Earth's intention is to maintain peaceful coexistence with our neighbors, continue developing our colonial infrastructure, and participate constructively in council proceedings. Verith listened to this, nodded once, and said, and your military capacity, as described in yesterday's submission, what are your intentions for it in the absence of a direct threat? Donnelly said, it will remain in place. It will not be directed at anyone who does not direct a threat at us first. Another nod. Verith glanced at her aides briefly, then back. We would like to begin preliminary discussions about a formal non-aggression framework between Earth and Pelivar. Nothing immediate. Simply an expression of mutual intent. Donnelly smiled, a small, real smile, not a diplomatic one. Earth would be very open to that, she said. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It was the first of 8 similar meetings over the following 11 days. 3 more species requested talks before the end of the first week. By the time the follow-up session came around, we had a meeting request pending from the Sorrenti, who were among the oldest and most respected species on the council, and had apparently decided that the human delegation was worth knowing better. None of this had been in any briefing document I had read. I began to wonder how much of what was happening had been anticipated and how much was genuinely new even to Donnelly. I asked her, the evening before the follow-up session, while we were reviewing materials in the preparation suite. She set down what she was reading and considered the question with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything. Some of it was anticipated, she said. The Croth response, the review request, the withdrawal of momentum that followed a predictable pattern. They are a careful species when they need to be, and they recognized they needed to be. She picked up her reading again. The Pelavar request was faster than we expected. The Sorrenti request was unexpected. What does the Sorrenti request mean? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. It means we are no longer being seen as a young species finding its way, she said. Which is a significant change. She turned a page. It carries responsibilities, Sergeant Ward. I know. I know you know, she glanced up briefly. I'm saying it anyway. Because responsibilities are easier to meet if you name them before they arrive rather than after. The follow-up session opened at 0900 station time. The chamber was full, if anything, more fully attended than the first session, with more observers in the gallery and more aides visible in the corners of each delegation's section. Whatever had spread through the station's diplomatic community over the past 11 days had apparently increased interest in watching whatever happened next. Vakrathen was present. He looked as composed as he always did. Whatever the Croth had concluded during their review, he was not going to show it in his posture or his expression. Counselor San opened proceedings, ran through the formalities, and moved directly to the Croth review of the human submission. Vakrathen stood. He spoke for approximately 6 minutes. The translation came clearly through my earpiece. He said that the Croth Dominion had completed its review of the documentation submitted by the human delegation in the previous session. He said that the Dominion's Territorial Assessment Committee had met and discussed the strategic and geographical considerations in detail. He said that following this review, the Dominion had concluded that the 3 worlds in question, Garvey's Reach, New Aberdeen, and the Mira Cluster, required further geological and astronomical survey work before their status within the Dominion's expansion corridor could be confirmed. He said that, pending the completion of this survey, which would take an indefinite amount of time, the territorial filing was being suspended. He said the word suspended very carefully. Not withdrawn. Suspended. It was a distinction that allowed the Croth to walk back without appearing to walk back, a face-saving mechanism that every species used when they needed it, and which every experienced diplomat recognized for exactly what it was. He sat down. Counselor San thanked the Croth delegation for their thorough review and noted the suspension for the council record. He turned to the human section. Ambassador Donnelly, does Earth wish to respond? Donnelly stood. Earth takes note of the Croth delegation's position and wishes the survey team a productive assessment process, she said. She sat back down. That was it. The statement had 3 parts, and all 3 of them were extraordinary in their restraint. She had not celebrated. She had not pointed at the obvious meaning of the suspension. She had not said anything that required the Croft to respond defensively. She had simply acknowledged, politely and completely neutrally, that they had said a thing, and moved on. It was the most effective non-response I had ever heard delivered. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Counselor San moved to the next item on the agenda, and the session continued, and the thing that would have been a major galactic confrontation was instead a procedural notation in council records, filed under Croft Territorial Assessment, Item 7741, H3, Status, Suspended Pending Survey. When we walked out of the chamber that day, 3 separate delegations stopped Donnelly in the corridor to exchange brief, warm greetings. A Marathi delegate, one of the ones who had watched us walk past on the first morning, with that look of calm amusement, caught my eye as we passed. He nodded. I nodded back. It was a very small exchange. I thought about it for a long time afterward. We had 2 more days on the station before our scheduled departure. Donnelly used them for meetings. I used them for my job, walking corridors, checking rooms, standing near important conversations and watching exits. But the texture of the work was different now. The station felt different around us than it had when we arrived. Not warmer, exactly, diplomatic environments don't really do warmth, in my experience, but different in a way I found difficult to name precisely. On the last morning, I walked down to the observation deck alone while Donnelly was in a final briefing. The station's interior plaza was below, that vast, open, colorful space full of species going about their business. I watched it for a while. 41 civilizations. Centuries of history. A chamber that had been sitting in this part of space for 400 years, making decisions and issuing statements and navigating the endless, complicated, never-finished work of many different kinds of people learning to share a galaxy. We had been part of it for about 72 hours. I thought about the people who would never come to this station. My unit back home. The engineers and the soldiers and the logistics teams. The people who had spent their careers quietly building what had sat on that data chip. Colonel Parrish, who had made a phone call at 4 in the morning with something behind his eyes that I now understood was not tension but satisfaction, the satisfaction of a person who has spent years preparing for a moment and has watched it arrive exactly as planned. None of them would stand in this chamber. None of them would walk these corridors. The work they had done was finished and behind them now, invisible in the record books of shipyards and training facilities and supply registries. But it was there. It had always been there. It had been there for years before anyone in this station had thought to look. I thought about what Orithkin had asked me. Were you afraid? And the answer I had given, which was honest, yes, every day. Because that was the part of the human story that nobody seemed to fully understand yet, not even most humans, if I was being truthful. It was not the force itself that was the story. It was the choice to build it. The choice made not in a moment of crisis, not in response to a direct threat, not out of aggression or ambition, but out of the quiet, steady, deeply human understanding that the universe is large and full of unknowns and the most important moment to prepare for is the one you cannot see coming. Every soldier who had ever signed up knowing there was no war. Every engineer who had ever built a ship that was never supposed to fire a weapon. Every budget officer who had found a way to make numbers add up correctly, every year, for decades, without anyone asking too loudly what they were adding up to. They had all made that choice. Daily. Quietly. Without ceremony. And it had added up to a data chip the size of my thumbnail, and a room full of 40 civilizations that had suddenly, completely, and irrevocably stopped underestimating us. I stood at the observation window and watched the ships moving in the distance, all those different shapes catching the light, and I felt something settle in my chest, not pride, or at least not only pride. Something more durable than that. Something that felt like the knowledge that you are, after a long period of uncertainty, exactly where you are supposed to be. My communicator vibrated. A message from Donnelly: we depart in 90 minutes. Preparation Bay 3. I took one more look at the plaza below. A small group of Sorrenti delegates were crossing the far end, moving slowly and steadily as their kind always did. One of them looked up, toward the observation deck, in my direction. It might have been coincidence. It might not have been. At this distance I could not read their expression. I straightened up. Tied my boots, both of them. Walked toward the door. We had a long transit home. I had a report to finish. And somewhere out there, in the space between stars, a very large number of very patient ships were holding their positions, waiting, nominal, exactly as described, because that was what we did. That was who we were. That was what we had always been, even before the galaxy knew to look. I walked out of the observation deck and into the corridor, and behind me, the stars continued their old, indifferent work of shining through the glass, the same as always, unchanged by anything that small and specific beings did among themselves in their brief and busy time below. The Galactic Council had fallen silent. We had simply stood there. And that had been enough.